Hi all. In a previous video, I gave an outline of the ontological argument for the existence of God. In this video, I will look at the various objections to it. If you haven't seen my previous video, you may wish to watch it first, so as to understand the philosophical and historical background to this video. The first objection made to the ontological argument was by Gornilo of Marmoutier, a Benedictine monk and a contemporary of St. Anselm. Contrary to my naive expectation, this is quite common when looking at arguments for God's existence. Even in an era of near-universal theism, objection to the argument arose almost immediately upon its publication. This is the case with all of the well-known arguments for God's existence, that there was never a period of time where they were generally accepted and that only later did atheists produce objections. What has consistently happened is that other theists have disagreed and argued against them from the moment they were advanced. Back to Gornilo. His objection was to Anselm's formulation of the ontological argument, and his reply was that if the ontological argument is sound, then it would establish the existence of far more than just a God. His particular example was that of the Lost Island, a mythical island that was more perfect than any other island that could be imagined. He argued that, using Anselm's argument, the island existing in reality would be greater than it existing only in imagination. That is, if it exists only in imagination, then there is a greater island that also exists in reality. Hence, such an island must also exist in reality. The point that Gornilo was making was that the existence of such an island is clearly absurd. But if the ontological argument is sound, then such an island must exist. Therefore, the ontological argument must be unsound. This objection doesn't pinpoint the actual problem in the ontological argument, but just shows that there must be one. Anselm's own and later defenders' response to this is to draw a distinction between islands and things. That is, they argue that the idea of a perfect or maximally great island is incoherent, but the idea of a maximally great being is not. The simplest way of putting this is to argue that an island with more palm trees or beaches is better than an island with fewer. But by this, there's no maximum number of palm trees or beaches, and so there can be no maximally great island. But this is a poor definition of maximally great island. My conception of a perfect island has a finite number of palm trees and beaches, and is simply the optimal size and shape for my enjoyment. This objection is akin to saying that a maximally great God can't exist because clearly having more hands is better than fewer, and hence God would have to have an infinite number of hands. So, the first obstacle that a proponent of the ontological argument will have to overcome is to provide an account of why the logic of the ontological argument cannot be used to prove the existence of clearly absurd objects, such as the Lost Island. To overcome this obstacle, later theists have argued that the true distinction between God and islands is that of abstraction. That is, that an island is a material, contingent object, and therefore can never be truly perfect or exist necessarily. However, on this argument, since God is immaterial, he can have necessary existence. This seems to me to be special pleading. I can see no reason why God isn't simply the pinnacle, necessary being at the end of a long chain of contingent demigods, just as the perfect island would be the pinnacle, necessary island at the end of a long chain of contingent islands. But even if this argument is correct, there is a further obstacle to be overcome. And the objection is the idea of a supreme devil. By definition, the devil is the most evil being, who is all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly wicked. Since such a devil would be more evil if it exists in reality as well as in the mind, it must exist in reality. This idea avoids the most common objections to the Lost Island objection. Few Christians would accept the existence of an all-powerful devil, and the existence of two omnipotent beings, God and the devil, presents its own problems. But if the ontological argument is sound, then it can be used to prove the existence of such an evil being. The only responses that theists have to this is to claim that evilness is not a perfection, and hence a maximally evil being is incoherent. but this seems to me to be special pleading. I can see no reason why existence and goodness must align as perfections, and existence and evilness must not. In fact, the only way that this could be argued is to appeal to some contingent fact of reality, which defeats the purpose of the ontological argument and undermines the claims of God's logical necessity. So, the second obstacle that a proponent of the ontological argument must overcome is to provide an account of why the logic of the ontological argument cannot be used to prove the existence of beings that are maximal in other respects, such as a maximally evil being. The third objection, often levelled at the ontological argument, is the idea of an omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent God is incoherent. But this objection only works against the forms of the ontological argument that include this definition of God, and most forms of the argument can do without it, except for Christians' dogmatic attachment to this definition. For example, Anselm's definition of that which none greater can be conceived need not imply infinite power, knowledge, or goodness. This being need only be maximally powerful, maximally knowledgeable, and maximally good, which could be far short of all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good. So, while this is a strong objection against most Christians' conception of their God, it is easy to reformulate the ontological argument to avoid this objection. David Hume proposed a further objection to the ontological argument. His argument was that the application of logic alone could only prove the existence of things whose non-existence would be a logical contradiction. But since any God that we can conceive of, we can also conceive of not existing, there is no concept of God whose non-existence would be a contradiction. Therefore, according to Hume, pure logical argument cannot establish the existence of anything, let alone a God. I hesitate to disagree with the great David Hume, but I don't think this argument holds. The problem here is that whether or not something can be conceived of is not an infallible indicator of logical necessity or contradiction. This criticism also applies to Anselm's formulation of the ontological argument, and is perhaps why most other versions don't define God as the greatest conceivable being. To make my point clear, let's think about maps of countries. Imagine that there's a part of Africa or Central Asia where the country's borders are so complex that when you come to colour in the countries, you find that every time you try to colour the countries so that countries that share a border have different colours, you seem to need more than 4 colours. Sound straightforward? Well, you've just conceived of a logical impossibility. It has been proven that you will only ever need 4 colours, no matter how complex the borders, but you can still conceive of needing more. Now, you may object that you didn't really conceive of this situation, since your imagination of it was vague and imprecise. But I'd argue that your conception of it was at least as meaningful as most people's conception of God. And so simply conceiving of something does not mean it's logically possible or logically impossible. Another objection that Hume raised, and which Immanuel Kant later elaborated on, is the idea that existence is not a property or predicate. That is, existence or non-existence is unlike other properties that something can have, like weight or colour or shape. On this account, the concept of God cannot include its existence or non-existence. Rather, if that concept is instantiated in reality, then it can be said to exist. If there is nothing in reality that corresponds to the concept, then it can be said to not exist. On this metaphysics, a unicorn can be said to have the property of being white or having 1 horn, but not the property of non-existence. That is, existence is actually a relationship that the concept has with reality, rather than something intrinsic to the concept itself. On this idea, Anselm's statement that to exist in reality is greater than to exist in the mind only is false, since a God that exists in the mind is identical to the same concept that also exists in reality. That is, since existence is not part of a concept, these two concepts are actually the same, and hence the argument is unsound. This ontology is widely accepted, and this is perhaps the dominant objection to the ontological argument. But although it is internally consistent and maps well to how most of us think the world works, it is ultimately unproven. Perhaps the best argument in favour of this ontology is that the opposing ontology is needlessly complex. To see why, suppose that existence is the property that things can have or not have. Then, for every object, there's a concept of it that has the property of existence, and another identical concept that has the property of not existing. But these non-existent things must have a pseudo-existence somewhere, since these concepts clearly exist. For example, I can conceive of a non-existent unicorn, and this concept exists somewhere. To account for this, you need some immaterial realm, perhaps akin to the Platonic realm of ideals. But then you run into all of the problems that such philosophies run into, including accounting for how we access such a realm, or how it relates to our reality, and why we should even believe that it exists. In the end, it's a realm created to account for things that need not be accounted for, and which William of Ockham might want to have a word about. So the third obstacle that a proponent of the ontological argument must overcome is to explain why existence should be considered a property of things, rather than a relationship between concepts and reality. The final objection to the ontological argument that I want to discuss is another of Kant's objections, this time on the basis of the analytic-synthetic distinction. Kant's argument here was that all analytic knowledge is already bound up in the definitions that we use. That is, the conclusion of any analytic argument is contained within its premises, and that all analytic arguments reduce to a tautology. In this way, Kant argued, no valid argument with analytic premises can have a synthetic conclusion. That is, an analytic argument can never prove the existence of anything. I think this is actually a devastating critique of the ontological argument, and I've yet to hear a decent response to it. Perhaps part of the reason that it goes largely unaddressed is because his other objection is more widely cited, and that this objection is usually couched in technical language. To this end, I will seek to rephrase it in more readily accessible and hopefully more intuitively understandable terms. To begin with, let's consider mathematical knowledge. Mathematical knowledge is a subset of analytical knowledge and is widely agreed to be knowable a priori. That is, mathematical theorems and truths are true in every possible world, not just this one, and so we could reason to these results regardless of the facts of reality. For example, the number 17 is prime purely through virtue of the various mathematical definitions that that statement rests on. The problem with calling this mathematical knowledge is this obscures the fact that every true mathematical statement can be reduced to a tautology. For example, that 1 plus 1 equals 2 can be reduced, depending on which axioms are being used, to the statement that the number after 1 in the counting numbers is defined as 2. This is simply a tautology, and rather than being a statement about what happens when you add one stone to another stone, this is just a statement about the definitions of numbers. The actually interesting thing to most people is that this corresponds with what happens in reality. But this correspondence is a synthetic proposition, not a purely analytic one. It is quite possible to derive endless mathematical statements that are true, but have absolutely no bearing on the way the world actually is. In fact, many would contend that this is what many mathematicians actually do. So, no purely mathematical statement can ever lead us to knowledge about the real world, as the fact that the mathematics actually corresponds to reality would first have to be established, and that is synthetic knowledge. So what about non-mathematical analytic arguments? The problem here is essentially the same. Any valid argument is equivalent to an argument in the form of modus ponens. A implies B, A, therefore B. In most non-trivial arguments, A will be a complex statement of conjunctions and implications, but nevertheless, it will be possible to put it into this form. The problem is that this form of argument is logically equivalent to if A implies B and A, then B, which is simply of the form if P, then Q. That is, every valid analytic argument is simply the assertion of some logical implication. All it is expressing is, If the premises are true, then the conclusion is true. But this is an implication and doesn't establish that the premises are actually true. A more succinct way of saying this is that no argument can establish its own soundness. We can examine an argument and determine whether it is valid or not, but there's no a priori way of determining whether it is sound or not. There is, however, one exception to this. Any tautological premise is necessarily true, and so any argument that proceeds from only tautological arguments can, in principle, be true a priori. The problem with this, though, is that there are no tautological synthetic statements. That is, there's no a priori way of determining which logical system reality must abide by, if any. So any tautological statements in our system of logic may or may not correspond to reality, just as any mathematical theorem may or may not correspond to reality. To establish that a given system of logic actually corresponds to reality, one would need to make reference to reality, which would depend on synthetic knowledge, which undermines the ontological argument. So, the fourth obstacle that a proponent of the ontological argument would need to overcome is to ensure that all of their premises are tautologies and not just intuitively or likely to be true. There are a few other objections that people have made to the ontological argument, but they tend to be rarely cited, not generally applicable to all forms of the argument, or generally uninteresting, so I'm not going to cover them here. I'd like to conclude by summarising what I think are the four obstacles that any proponent of the ontological argument would need to overcome in order for the argument to have any weight. 1. Why does the argument prove God exists, but not a maximally great island? 2. Why does the argument prove God exists, but not a maximally evil devil? 3. Why is existence a property of objects, not a relationship between concepts and reality? And 4. Why does the argument have synthetic premises if God's existence is logically necessary? While I've worded the fourth obstacle in somewhat academic language, a less formal way of putting it is to simply ask an apologist why their argument doesn't just boil down to if P then Q. That is, how can their purely logical argument make no reference to the way the world is, but presume to prove something about reality? Every valid logical argument is simply saying, if the premises are true, then the conclusion is true. So how can this argument also establish that its premises are true? While this is not a new objection, and is one that many people have come to intuitively, I hope to have put some more rigorous analysis behind it in this video. Thank you for watching.